The breakfast rush had just ended, and the diner was finally quiet. The smell of fresh coffee still lingered in the air, and the hum of the radio played softly in the background. The young waitress wiped the counter, exhausted, but forcing herself to smile, her feet aching from the long morning shift. Then she noticed him. An old man sat alone at the corner booth, his frail hands slowly counting the small pile of coins in front of him. His shoulders were slightly hunched, his clothes were neat but worn, and there was something about the way he stared at the menu, hopeful yet hesitant. She watched as his fingers trembled while he reached into his pocket again, searching, counting, only to sigh heavily and lower his gaze. The waitress didn't hesitate. She walked up to the register and quietly slipped in a few dollars from her own tip money, covering his bill without a word. When she turned back toward the old man, he was staring at her, eyes filled with disbelief. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked softly. She smiled gently, placing a hot plate of food in front of him. Because everyone deserves a warm meal, she thought nothing of it. But the next morning, her phone rang, and when she answered, her entire world changed forever. Have you ever seen kindness come back in unexpected ways? Share your story in the comments. By the end of this story, you'll see how one small decision can change everything. The bell above the diner door jingled softly as the last of the morning customers trickled out. The waitress let out a quiet sigh, rolling her aching shoulders as she grabbed a damp cloth and wiped down the counter. She had been on her feet for hours, running between tables, balancing plates, and forcing smiles for customers who barely looked up when they placed their orders. It was just another long morning, just another shift. She wasn't one to complain, though. She needed this job. The bills at home weren't going to pay themselves, and every dollar she made brought her a step closer to stability. She had dreams, big ones, but for now, this little diner and her hard-working hands were all she had. She glanced toward the clock. Still 2 more hours until her break. That's when she noticed him. An old man sat alone at the corner booth, staring at the menu with an unreadable expression. He looked like he belonged to another time. His clothes were neat but worn, his hands slightly calloused, his silver hair combed back as if he still took pride in his appearance. But what caught her attention wasn't his age. It was the hesitation in his movements. She watched as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of coins, slowly counting them on the table. His fingers trembled slightly as he separated the quarters from the nickels, his face growing more uncertain with each passing second. Then she saw it, the way his shoulders slumped, the moment his eyes darkened with quiet disappointment. He didn't have enough. The waitress's heart clenched. She had seen this before. People coming in, hoping for a meal, only to realize they couldn't afford one. Some left before ordering. Others pretended they weren't hungry and just asked for coffee. And then there were those, like this old man, who sat there debating whether or not to walk away hungry. She didn't even think. Turning back toward the register, she reached into her aproned pocket and pulled out a few dollars from her tip money. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to cover his meal. Enough to make sure he didn't have to leave without eating. She didn't do it for attention. She didn't do it expecting anything in return. She did it because no one should have to count coins just to eat. The moment she placed the order slip in the kitchen, she walked over to the old man's booth, forcing her usual bright smile. "What can I get for you today, sir?" she asked kindly. The old man looked up, startled, as if snapped out of a daze. He hesitated before clearing his throat. Just coffee, please," he murmured. "Nothing else." The waitress shook her head. "How about some eggs and toast with that? Maybe a side of bacon?" The old man blinked. I don't think I can." She cut him off with a warm grin. "Don't worry about it. Breakfast is on me today." his mouth opened slightly in shock, his weathered face frozen in disbelief. "Why would you do that for me?" he asked softly. The waitress placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of him and set down a hot plate of food. "Because everyone deserves a warm meal." For a moment, the old man just stared at her, his eyes, deep, kind, filled with something she couldn't quite place, glossed over slightly as he swallowed hard. He didn't argue. He didn't insist on paying her back. Instead, he just nodded slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." She smiled, patting the table lightly before walking away. She never asked his name. She never thought twice about it. She had no idea that this one simple act of kindness was about to change her life forever. The next morning, the waitress barely had time to breathe before her shift started again. The diner was packed, filled with regulars, early commuters, and the usual clatter of plates and coffee cups. She was used to the rush, balancing trays, taking orders, dodging impatient customers who waved her down like they were the only ones in the room. She was exhausted, but that was nothing new. She hadn't thought about the old man since he left. It was just a meal, just kindness, something she had done 100 times before. People came and went, and she never expected anything in return. But then, in the middle of her shift, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. For a moment, she considered letting it go to voicemail, but something told her to answer. "Hello?" she said, balancing a notepad in one hand and a coffee pot in the other. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "Is this Miss Evelyn Carter?" Her brows furrowed. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Mr. Reynolds. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. James Whitmore." The name meant nothing to her. She didn't know a James Whitmore. Her stomach tensed slightly. Was this a scam? A bill collector? She already had enough on her plate. She didn't need another problem. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person." She started to hang up, but the voice quickly continued. "Miss Carter, James Whitmore was the gentleman you served breakfast to yesterday." Her breath caught in her throat. The old man, the one who had counted his coins at the booth. Her grip on the phone tightened. Is he okay?" A brief pause. Then the man sighed. "I'm afraid Mr. Whitmore passed away last night." Evelyn's heart dropped. She turned away from the customers, stepping behind the counter, pressing the phone tighter against her ear. "Oh, my God," she whispered. I'm so sorry." The man on the other end was quiet for a moment before speaking again. "I understand this is unexpected, but before he passed, Mr. Whitmore instructed us to contact you personally. He left something for you in his will." Evelyn stopped breathing. Her mind struggled to keep up with the words. A will? Left something for her? She swallowed hard, shaking her head as if the man could see her confusion. "I don't understand. I only met him once. I just paid for his breakfast." "Yes, ma'am," the man said gently, and that one act of kindness changed everything. Evelyn felt dizzy. She clutched the edge of the counter, her legs suddenly weak. Customers chatted around her, completely unaware that her entire world had just been turned upside down. "Can you come to our office today? Mr. Whitmore wanted you to receive this personally." Her hands shook slightly. She didn't know what to say, didn't know what any of this meant. But one thing was certain. Her life would never be the same again. Evelyn's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled into the parking lot of an upscale office building. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had spent the entire drive trying to make sense of what was happening. This had to be a mistake. Mr. Whitmore had been a kind old man, but a stranger nonetheless. She had only met him once, for a few minutes. She had covered his meal because it was the right thing to do, not because she expected anything in return. Now, A lawyer was telling her that the man, this quiet, frail gentleman she had barely spoken to, had left something for her in his will. None of it made sense. She took a deep breath, stepped out of her car, and walked into the building. The receptionist greeted her warmly and led her to a sleek office, where a middle-aged man in a sharp suit was waiting. "Miss Carter," he said with a polite smile, standing to shake her hand. "I'm Mr. Reynolds. Please have a seat." Evelyn sat down, her fingers nervously twisting together in her lap. I don't really understand what's happening," she admitted, her voice unsteady. Mr. Reynolds nodded, flipping open a thick file on his desk. "I imagine this is quite a shock for you. Let me explain." Evelyn held her breath. "Mr. Whitmore was not just any man," the lawyer began. "He was a retired businessman, a self-made millionaire. He built one of the largest real estate firms in the state, but after losing his wife and only son years ago, he chose to live a quiet life, away from wealth and attention." Evelyn's stomach twisted. She had assumed he was just another struggling elderly man, but he had been a millionaire? "In his final years," Mr. Reynolds continued, "he made it a habit to observe how people treated others, especially those they assumed had nothing to offer in return. He had encountered a lot of greed, a lot of selfishness. But then yesterday, he met you." Evelyn's throat tightened. "You didn't know who he was," Mr. Reynolds said gently. "You didn't expect anything from him. Yet, you showed him kindness, something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. That's why he chose you." Evelyn felt her chest ache. She had only done what any decent person should do, but to Mr. Whitmore it had meant something more. Mr. Reynolds reached for a sealed envelope and slid it across the desk toward her. "This is for you," he said. "It was Mr. Whitmore's final wish that you receive it personally." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she picked up the envelope. Slowly, she tore it open, unfolding the letter inside. Her eyes widened. A single check sat inside, written out in her name. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. She read the number again, then again, but her brain refused to believe it. $250,000. Her hand clamped over her mouth. Her entire body went cold. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. Her voice shook. I can't accept this. It's too much." Mr. Reynolds gave her a small smile. "Mr. Whitmore was very clear. He wanted you to have this, no conditions. He hoped it would help change your life the way your kindness changed his last day." Evelyn couldn't hold back the tears anymore. They spilled down her cheeks as she stared at the check, her mind racing. This money could pay off her debts, help her quit her exhausting job, allow her to finally chase the dreams she had been forced to put on hold. She had never met a man like Mr. Whitmore before, and she probably never would again. With shaky hands, she clutched the letter to her chest, whispering through her tears, "Thank you." Evelyn sat frozen in the chair, her hands gripping the check as though it might disappear if she let go. The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. How was this real? She had spent years struggling to make ends meet, sacrificing sleep, skipping meals, working double shifts just to survive. And now, because of one small act of kindness, her life was being rewritten in ways she had never imagined. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve this." Mr. Reynolds smiled gently, his gaze warm with understanding. "That's exactly why you do." Tears blurred her vision as she wiped at her face, still trying to comprehend everything. "What kind of man does something like this for a stranger?" she asked, her voice shaking. The lawyer leaned back slightly, folding his hands on the desk. "Mr. Whitmore believed in the power of small moments," he explained. "For years, he watched people. He watched how they treated those who had nothing to give back. And, more often than not, he was disappointed. but then he met you. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat, thinking back to the diner. She had seen an old man counting his coins, looking defeated. That was all it took for her to act. She didn't hesitate. She didn't ask for anything in return. She had just helped. Mr. Reynolds slid another envelope across the desk. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached for it, unfolding the paper inside. Her breath hitched. It wasn't just a letter. It was a deed. She scanned the words, her pulse hammering. Property ownership. A small coffee shop downtown. Fully paid for. In her name. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock. I don't understand, Mr. Reynolds chuckled softly. Mr. Whitmore overheard you talking to a coworker yesterday about your dream of owning your own cafe one day. He wanted to make that happen for you. Evelyn felt her entire world shift beneath her. She had mentioned it in passing. Just a dream, something she never thought could actually happen. And now, it was hers. Tears streamed down her face. She clutched the paper to her chest, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. One meal, one act of kindness. That was all it took to change her life forever. Evelyn clutched the deed in her trembling hands, her heart pounding. She had walked into this office thinking she was just a waitress, another struggling worker trying to make ends meet. And now, she was a business owner. A life she had only dreamed of was suddenly real. She sat in stunned silence for a long moment, overwhelmed by the weight of Mr. Whitmore's generosity. The lawyer gave her time, allowing her to process it all. Then he spoke gently. Mr. Whitmore wanted you to know that he believed in you. He saw something special in you, and he hoped this would give you the chance to chase what you truly wanted in life. Evelyn wiped at her tears, a small, shaky laugh escaping her lips. I don't even know how to thank him, she whispered. Mr. Reynolds nodded. I think you already did. Later that day, Evelyn stood in front of her new cafe. It was a cozy little place, the kind of spot where people gathered for morning coffee, where small conversations filled the air, and where dreams were built over warm pastries and late-night espressos. She had spent years serving coffee and food to others, barely scraping by, never believing she'd have the chance to do something for herself. And now, she was holding the keys to her future. Walking inside, she ran her fingers along the countertop, imagining what this space could become. The walls, the tables, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. She could already see it, her cafe, her dream, and it had all started with one small act of kindness. Weeks passed, and Evelyn threw herself into making the cafe her own. She worked harder than ever, but this time, it wasn't just to survive. It was to build something meaningful. She hired staff, people like her, who knew what it meant to struggle but also knew the power of kindness. She created a pay-it-forward board, where customers could leave prepaid coffee or meals for strangers who needed them, a small way to continue the kindness that had changed her life. And every morning, she would pour herself a cup of coffee, take a deep breath, and silently thank Mr. Whitmore. One day, a customer walked in, a young man, clearly down on his luck. Evelyn noticed the hesitation in his eyes, the way he stared at the menu, debating whether he could afford anything. Without thinking, she walked up to the counter and smiled. "Coffee's on me today." The young man blinked in shock. "Are you sure?" She nodded, remembering the moment she had done the same thing for Mr. Whitmore. Everyone deserves a warm meal. As the young man sat down, sipping his coffee, Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her chest. Mr. Whitmore had given her more than just money, more than just a cafe. He had given her a lesson, a reminder that kindness doesn't just change one life. It creates ripples, touching lives in ways we may never see. And now, it was her turn to pass it on. Evelyn's life changed because of one small act of kindness. She never expected anything in return, never imagined that a simple meal for a stranger would rewrite her future. But that's the power of compassion. It has a way of coming back in ways we never see coming. She went from a struggling waitress to a business owner, from serving coffee to creating a space where kindness could continue to grow. Have you ever experienced a moment where kindness changed your life? Share your story in the comments. If you believe in the power of small acts of kindness, hit that like button and share this story, because the world needs more reminders that generosity can change lives. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. See you in the next video, where one decision changes everything.